And the Jews end up having to wonder whether they're able to enforce human rights or whether they need to protect their own people and their own nation. So they're really caught in the middle. Now, since 1948, the general trend has been absolute conflict. There's been this general trend where the only way for the Arabs to feel like they get a voice within the territory of Israel is to use violence, is to use terrorism. The military occupation is also fairly violent and fairly controlling. But at the same time, Israel feels that it's what's necessary to protect their people. Now, is that military occupation something permanent or something temporary? That's really a big question because they've been technically occupying part of Palestinian land for decades now, and there's no real end in sight. So, what is a long term solution? How do you get a legal state, which Israel is a legal state, but you have this moral wrongdoing in the sense that there are human rights violations? Now, there are human rights violations on both sides, and the Arabs want a legal state as well. I don't know if you remember, but this past Olympics was the first time that they had an Arab state, like a Palestinian state, as a team. So there's a lot of controversy surrounding this, especially when you look at this trend, when you look at the pattern that's been forming. It's hard to make sense of what a good solution is for all of this. But let's start with this map in the front, or I'm sorry, in the top. This is Palestine in 1923. So this is under the British Mandate. It's unified as one territory under the British Mandate. This will also be a British mandate, but this was kind of set aside for the Arabs. Wasn't what they wanted, but it was put aside for Transjordan. The partition plan, you can see that it was broken into the two states. And of course, the UN would control Jerusalem in the center. But it was basically 56-44 split. Fast forward, this is after the 1948 war, and you can see again the Jewish state is in green. They ended up getting much more territory than was given to them. They unified it, all that territory under the nation of Israel. This is an interesting scenario. So in 67, there was the 6 Days War, where there was some territory here that originally belonged to Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, that Israel gained from the war. They won the war and they ended up claiming that territory. Now, eventually, they will trade that land back to Egypt in exchange for peace. And to this day, Israel is recognized by Egypt as a legitimate country, and Egypt is the only Arab nation who's done so. They're technically occupying the West Bank, Golan Heights, which is kind of up here, and the Gaza Strip today. You may be familiar with some of those terms because it's still in the news. But you can see the Sinai Peninsula over time was traded back. So you can see here, this is a map of the 1948 war. And you can see literally all the Arab nations that are surrounding Israel invade. This was a pretty quick attack, too. Egypt invades from the south. You have Jordan, you have Lebanon, you have Iraq and Syria and Saudi. All of these nations are invading Israel in the 48 war. And not only does the little nation survive, but they also end up gaining more territory. And you can see this is a little more modern day map down here, but you can see how Israel's territory has grown since the UN partition plan, before and after the partition plan, and even until present day. Now, one of the big human rights violations that we see is this idea of a wall. And you can see this right here. This is actually around the West Bank, right here in this area. The wall is meant to protect the Jewish people from what they see as terrorism and hostile people. This is taking place in here in the West Bank. The Jews are moving into these neighborhoods and they need protection. It's hostile territory. It's Arab lands that don't want to see the Israeli nation there, and so they construct this wall, hopefully trying to add that protection, but at the same time, it's creating this massive division. And you can see the difference in quality. This is a lot of green, new suburbia almost. And this is kind of like the rundown slums. You can only assume who's on which side. the one that's being protected or the one that's being shut out. So Israel is not exactly in the greatest scenario, in not even today. They're still fighting this conflict today. But at the same time, hopefully now you understand a little bit about how they got that way. And we're going to kind of stop in the 60s with the Arab-Israeli conflict, and we'll come back to this in the Cold War era. But hopefully now you get a little understanding of what happened with Israel in the post-World War II era.